Honey, this is a hearing for adults about adult issues. Why don't you go back to school and let the grown-ups handle the policy? Senator Calvin Whitlock's voice rolled out of the marble-paneled hearing room of the United States Senate Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, picked up by every microphone on the dais and broadcast live on C-SPAN to an audience that, until that exact moment, had been roughly 17,000 viewers and was about to become considerably larger. The black teenager sitting at the witness table in a navy blazer and small pearl earrings did not flinch. She did not blink. She set down the pen she had been holding. She folded her hands beside her. The executive director of the National Education Equity Coalition began to lean toward her microphone to respond, but the girl raised one finger very slightly, and the executive director stopped mid-motion. The girl looked at Senator Whitlock for 3 full seconds. Then she stood up. The chamber went silent. 17 senators and 43 staff members and 112 members of the public sitting in the gallery watched as a 16-year-old in a navy blazer pressed the button on her microphone, leaned in, and began to speak. By the time she finished her second sentence, Senator Calvin Whitlock's re-election campaign, and a great many other things, had begun to dissolve in real time on every screen in America. 6 years earlier, Imani Brookshire had been 10 years old, and her parents had been sitting across a kitchen table in Detroit, having the kind of argument that careful parents have when they have run out of options. Imani was, by every objective measure her elementary school could produce, well past the ceiling of what her elementary school could offer. She had taught herself to read at 3. She had completed her older brother's 7th grade math workbook for fun the summer before she started kindergarten. By 2nd grade, she had been quietly removed from her regular classroom for 40 minutes a day so she could do independent work with the school's lone gifted and talented coordinator, a woman in her 60s named Mrs. Allen, who had retired the year Imani turned 8 and had not been replaced. The argument at the kitchen table was about what to do next. Imani's father, Marcus, was a postal worker who had finished 1 year of community college before his own father had gotten sick, and the family had needed his paycheck. He believed, with the particular conviction of a man who had been told no 1,000 times in his own life, that the only path for his daughter was to push hard and visibly against every institution that tried to slow her down. Imani's mother, Naomi, was a labor and delivery nurse who had grown up in rural Mississippi and who had watched in her own childhood what happened to gifted black children whose visibility outran the patience of the systems around them. Naomi believed in protection. Marcus believed in expansion. They had been having variations of this argument for 2 years. That particular night they were having it because a private foundation in Boston had just offered Imani a full scholarship, room and board included, to a residential program for profoundly gifted children, a program that would have meant her leaving Detroit at the age of 10. They said no. They had said no, in fact, to 3 different programs of escalating prestige over the previous 18 months. Then, 3 weeks later, Imani had walked into the kitchen at 6 in the morning with the application packet she had filled out by herself on the family computer for a Boston program neither of her parents had heard of. And she had set it on the table next to her father's coffee cup, and she had said, in the careful adult voice she had been using since she was 4, "Daddy, I love you. I love Mama. I want to go. I will come home every break. I will call every Sunday. I will work as hard as I can. I am not asking you to let me. I am asking you to come with me." He had put his head in his hands. He had cried for the first time in front of his daughter since her grandfather's funeral. He had said yes. 3 months later, the family had moved to a small apartment in Cambridge, Massachusetts, paid for by the foundation. Marcus had taken a transfer to a postal facility in Boston. Naomi had taken a position at Mass General. Imani had started the residential program at 10 years old, as the youngest student in its 18-year history. She graduated from the program in 2 years instead of the standard 4. She entered Harvard at the age of 12 on a full scholarship with a particular professor of educational policy named Dr. Eleanor Sato as her faculty mentor. She majored in government with a secondary field in economics. She wrote her senior thesis on the structural mechanisms by which federal Title I funding fails to reach the classrooms that most need it, and on the specific role of mid-career senators in obstructing reform. The thesis was 411 pages long. It was awarded the highest honors the department had bestowed in 9 years. She graduated summa cum laude at the age of 16 in the spring of her commencement year, becoming, by a margin of 2 months, the youngest graduate in the recorded history of Harvard College. The university's communications office had, at the family's request, declined to publicize the fact. Imani had given a brief, quiet address at her own departmental ceremony in front of her parents and her brother and 3 professors. She had then driven, with her family, to a clam shack on the Massachusetts coast where she had eaten fried scallops in a navy blazer, with the small Harvard insignia still pinned to the lapel. Senator Calvin Whitlock was 58 years old that morning in Washington. He had served 3 terms in the United States Senate, representing a southern state his grandfather had also represented 60 years earlier, in a different and considerably less amended legal context. Whitlock had a law degree from the state university his family had endowed a building at. He had spent 4 years in a corporate law practice before running for state legislature at 30. He had been groomed for the Senate by a political machine that had not produced a meaningful policy idea in 2 decades and that survived instead, on the basis of careful committee assignments and the kind of donor relationships that made campaign finance reformers reach for blood pressure medication. He had a particular style on committee that the political press had once called folksy and now more cautiously called performative. He liked to address witnesses, especially female witnesses, as honey, sweetheart, and dear. He liked to ask rhetorical questions that did not invite answers. He liked, more than almost anything in his professional life, the precise moment in a televised hearing when he could be seen on camera deflating the testimony of someone he had decided was a waste of the committee's time. His own staff had quietly attempted, twice in the previous 5 years, to retire him from the practice. He had refused. He believed it was good politics. His campaign manager, who had been losing arguments with him about it for 9 years, had given up the previous fall. The hearing that morning was on the reauthorization of federal Title I funding, the largest single federal grant program supporting low-income school districts in the United States. The committee had invited testimony from 3 witnesses on the impact of proposed funding cuts. The lead witness was Dr. Vanessa Reyes, the executive director of the National Education Equity Coalition, who had been preparing for the hearing for 3 months. The second witness was a superintendent from a rural Tennessee district. The third witness was Imani Brookshire, seated quietly in the 3rd chair, listed on the committee's official roster simply as Brookshire, Imani, Harvard College. The clerk had not included the degree designation because Imani had asked that it be left off. Imani had requested the witness slot through Dr. Sato, her mentor, who had connections to the committee's minority staff. The committee chairman, a careful Vermont Democrat in his 2nd term, had approved the witness list without paying particular attention to the 3rd name on it. He had assumed, based on the description, that Harvard College meant Harvard undergraduate student. He had not asked what year. Imani had been sworn in at 10:14 a.m. She had sat quietly through the chairman's opening statement, the ranking member's opening statement, Dr. Reyes's 17-minute testimony, the Tennessee superintendent's 9-minute testimony, and the first round of questioning, which had been polite, substantive, and largely useless. At 11:38 a.m., the chairman recognized Senator Whitlock for 5 minutes of questioning. Whitlock used 4 of his 5 minutes asking Dr. Reyes a series of leading questions about waste, fraud, and abuse in federal education spending. Dr. Reyes, who had testified before 23 congressional committees in her career, handled the questions with the patient precision of a woman who had been handled by men like Whitlock for 30 years. With 40 seconds remaining on his clock, Whitlock turned his attention, for the first time, to Imani. He squinted at the witness placard in front of her seat. He smiled the smile he saved for cameras, he said in the rolling baritone he had perfected at 1,000 county fairs. Now I see we have a young person on the panel today. Miss Brookshire, is that right, honey? Yes, Senator. Imani. That's a pretty name. And you're a student, I take it? I am, Senator. Wonderful. Wonderful. Now I want to say something, and I want to say it kindly. I think it's wonderful that young people want to be involved in their government. I really do. My own grandchildren take an interest. But you know, I look at this witness list, and I see Dr. Reyes with her 30 years of experience, and I see the superintendent here with his 40 years in the schools, and then I see you. And honey, I just have to say, and again, I mean this kindly, this is a hearing for adults, about adult issues. Why don't you go back to school and let the grown-ups handle the policy. The chamber did the small particular thing it does when a senator says, on camera, something everyone in the room recognizes as a mistake. The clerk's eyes lifted. The chairman, behind his microphone, drew in a slow breath. Dr. Reyes turned her head 3 degrees toward Imani. 2 reporters in the press gallery began typing in earnest. A young staffer behind the dais leaned over and whispered urgently to the senator beside his boss, who waved her off. Imani Brookshire set down her pen. She folded her hands. She looked at Senator Whitlock for 3 full seconds. Then she stood up. The standing was not theatrical. It was in some ways the quietest thing in the room. She did not adjust her blazer. She did not raise her voice. She pressed the button on her microphone. The small green light came on, and she leaned in by perhaps 2 inches. Her voice, when it emerged, was the steady, careful voice of a 16-year-old who had spent 6 years learning to be taken seriously by adults who did not particularly want to take her seriously. Senator Whitlock, thank you for your concern about my education. I would like to take a moment to address it for the committee's record. He believed, in that moment, that he had just teed himself up for a charming exchange in which the young witness would graciously acknowledge his point and the hearing would move on. He believed this for approximately 4 more seconds. My name is Imani Brookshire. I am 16 years old. I graduated from Harvard College 2 months ago, summa cum laude, with a degree in government and a secondary field in economics. I am, by a margin of approximately 7 weeks, the youngest graduate in the recorded history of Harvard College. My senior thesis was 411 pages long and was titled Structural Obstruction and Title I Reauthorization, a 40-year review of Senate committee behavior. It is publicly available through the Harvard Government Department website. I am familiar with it because I wrote it. The thesis identifies by name 11 senators whose committee conduct over the past 4 decades has materially obstructed the reform of the program this committee is meeting today to reauthorize. You are named in the thesis, Senator, 3 times. The most recent reference, on page 247, concerns your floor remarks during the 2019 reauthorization debate, in which you describe the program's beneficiaries as, quote, kids who have already decided they don't want to learn, end quote. The footnote indicates the source as the congressional record. She paused. She did not look at her notes. She did not have any notes. I am not testifying today as a student, Senator. I am testifying as a lead policy researcher for the National Education Equity Coalition's Title I Working Group, a position I have held for 6 months. I am testifying because Dr. Reyes asked me to. I am testifying because the funding formula this committee is considering will, according to the modeling I conducted personally, in which Dr. Reyes will be submitting for the record, reduce per pupil federal support in 1,741 of the country's poorest school districts by an average of 9.3% over the next 4 years. I am testifying because 3 of those districts are in your state, Senator. I am testifying because one of them includes the elementary school in which my own mother learned to read. I am testifying because the version of me who didn't get out of Detroit at the age of 10 is, at this moment, sitting in a 2nd grade classroom in one of these districts. And the question this committee is meeting to decide is whether her school will have a librarian next year. The reason I went to school, Senator, was so that I could come here today and answer questions like the one you just asked. I have gone to school. I am the result. I would now like to return to the substance of the testimony with the chairman's permission. The chamber did not breathe. Senator Whitlock's mouth opened. No sound came out. His hand, on top of his briefing book, was perfectly still. The young staffer behind the dais had her hand pressed to her own mouth. The chairman, after a long pause, leaned into his microphone and said very quietly, "The witness will continue with her testimony." Senator Whitlock's time has expired. Imani sat down. She unfolded her hands. She picked up her pen. The ranking member, a Republican senator from Iowa, named Margaret Holloway, who had spent 22 years on the committee and who had been waiting, with the kind of patience particular to women of her generation in that institution, for an opportunity like the one that had just been served to her, leaned into her microphone and asked the chairman if she could use 30 seconds of her own time before the next questioner. The chairman nodded. Senator Holloway turned to Imani. She said, "Miss Brookshire, I have one question. With the committee's indulgence, Have you ever, in any of your work for the coalition, identified a senator from my party whose conduct on this issue has been constructive? Imani did not hesitate. She said, yes, Senator. Your floor speech in 2017 opposing the proposed elimination of the Title I Evaluation Office is cited in my thesis as one of 7 instances of bipartisan obstruction prevention I identified in the past 2 decades. The footnote is on page 312. Senator Holloway nodded once. Slowly. She said, thank you, Miss Berkshire. Mr. Chairman, I yield back. The next senator recognized was a freshman Democrat from Colorado who used 4 of his 5 minutes asking Imani follow-up questions about the funding model. She answered each one in the careful, unhurried sentences of a person who had built the model herself and knew, the way a mechanic knows an engine, where every component sat and what each one did. The senator after him, a careful Republican from Nebraska who had not yet decided how he intended to vote on the reauthorization, asked her whether her modeling had accounted for state-level matching variability. She said yes, and walked him through the methodology. He thanked her at the end of his 5 minutes and, by the account of his chief of staff to a reporter the following week, walked back to his office and told his policy team to draft an amendment based on the 3rd recommendation in her thesis. Senator Whitlock did not ask any further questions. He did not, in fact, speak again for the remainder of the hearing. He sat in his chair on the dais with his hands folded over his briefing book. His pollster, 2,000 miles away, was already on the phone with his campaign manager. The hearing lasted another 2 hours and 17 minutes. Imani spoke for an additional 43 minutes of it, walking the committee through the funding model district by district, answering questions from 4 different senators with a kind of fluency that made the committee staff in real time begin pulling her thesis up on their laptops and reading sections of it during the hearing. The video clip of the exchange with Senator Whitlock, 8 minutes and 14 seconds, including her standing, was uploaded to the committee's official YouTube channel that evening as part of the routine hearing archive. It was clipped by an education reporter at MSNBC. Within an hour, it crossed 200 million views on social media within 72 hours. The phrase, "I have gone to school, I am the result," became by the end of that weekend a hashtag that was briefly the most used phrase on the platform formerly known as Twitter on 3 continents. By Monday morning, Senator Whitlock's communications director had resigned. By Tuesday, his pollster had presented him with internal numbers showing a 14-point drop in his approval rating in his own state, including a 23-point drop among Black women and a 19-point drop among white women under 50. By Wednesday, 2 of the largest individual donors to his re-election campaign, both retired executives who had given the maximum allowable amount in each of his 3 previous campaigns, had publicly announced they were withdrawing their support. By Friday, the senator's campaign manager, who had been trying to get him to retire for 9 years, had finally succeeded. Whitlock announced the following Monday that he would not seek a 4th term. His press release cited spending more time with his grandchildren. His grandchildren, by the account of his oldest daughter, had not been informed of this plan in advance and had a number of questions when they learned of it on the news. The Title I reauthorization passed 3 months later. The version that emerged from committee, heavily amended on the strength of Imani's modeling, protected per-pupil federal support in the 1,741 districts she had identified, including the 3 in Whitlock State. The elementary school in which Naomi Brookshire had learned to read kept its librarian. The librarian's name was Mrs. Annette Carver. Mrs. Carver had been a 2nd-grade teacher at the same school 40 years earlier and had taught Naomi how to sound out the word together. She wrote Imani a letter the week the bill passed. The letter was 3 sentences long. It said, "My dear, your mama was the best reader in my class in 1979. I knew then that her children would do something. I did not know it would be this. Thank you." Imani entered Harvard Law School 3 weeks after her 17th birthday. She lived, by the family's choice, at home with her parents in Cambridge. She took the bus to class every morning. She graduated 3 years later, at 20, summa cum laude again. She clerked for a federal appellate judge, then for a Supreme Court justice, then took a position as senior policy counsel for the same Senate committee where at 16 she had stood and spoken. She was, at 23, the youngest person ever to hold the role. The chairman, who had recognized her time during her own testimony, was, by then, the committee's ranking member, and he had personally requested her appointment. The first piece of legislation she drafted for the committee was a bill expanding federal support for early identification programs for profoundly gifted children in Title I districts. The bill was named, at the chairman's quiet insistence and over Imani's polite objection, the Brookshire Act. The Brookshire Act passed in the fall of Imani's 25th year. She was present in the gallery for the floor vote. Her parents sat on either side of her. Marcus Brookshire wore a tie. Naomi Brookshire wore the same small gold cross she had worn to the swearing-in ceremony at her daughter's elementary school graduation 15 years earlier. When the final tally was announced and the bill passed by 68 to 32 votes, the gallery applauded quietly, as gallery decorum requires. Marcus Brookshire wept openly. Naomi Brookshire did not weep, because Naomi Brookshire had learned in her own childhood in Mississippi that weeping in public was a thing a black woman did only in particular kinds of rooms, and the Senate gallery was not one of them. Imani held her mother's hand. She did not weep either. She looked, instead, at the floor of the Senate chamber below her, at the empty seat where 9 years earlier a senator had told her to go back to school. The seat was now occupied by the senator's successor, a 38-year-old former teacher from the same state who had defeated Whitlock's hand-picked replacement in a special election the spring after the Title I hearing. The successor had run on a single slogan which her campaign manager had borrowed, with permission, from a hashtag. The slogan had been printed on her bumper stickers and on the side of her campaign bus, and on the small wooden plaque that now sat on her Senate desk, where every visitor could see it. The plaque read, in clean black letters on white, "I have gone to school. I am the result." She had bought the original from a high school art class in her district that had been about to lose its funding. The funding had been restored 2 months later by the bill the daughter of a postal worker had sat down to draft after she had stood, at 16, in a marble-paneled hearing room and politely declined to be condescended to on the public record.